All right, now the first figure I want to talk a little bit about, and the first figure whom you read for today's assignment, is I.A. Richards. Richards, before he joined the English department at Cambridge, was actually a psychologist and trained as a Pavlovian psychologist, so that when you read in his essay about stimuli and needs, you see pretty much where you stand. It is, I mean, his sense of the way in which the mind reacts to the world, to its experience, the way in which it's an uncomplicated reaction or a resisting reaction or an adjusting reaction, all has very much to do with Pavlovian principles. And these governed, to some extent, Richards's understanding of even of his literary vocation during the period when he wrote, 1924, when he wrote Principles of Literary Criticism. For Richards, reading is all about experience. That is to say, the way in which the mind is affected by what it reads. And so, even though his subject matter is literature, he's nevertheless constantly talking about human psychology. That is to say, what need is answered by literature, how the psyche responds to literature, what's good and bad about psychic responses, and so on. This is the intellectual focus, in other words, of Richards's work. Now, another aspect of his having been and continuing to be a scientist is that Richards really did believe, seriously believed, in reference. That is to say, in the way in which language really can hook onto the world. Verifiable and falsifiable statement is for Richards the essence of scientific practice, and he cares very much about that. That is, it's not, I mean, he does not, in other words, share with so many literary critics, perhaps even with Brooks, who follows him in making the fundamental distinction I'm about to describe. He does not share with the majority of literary critics and artists a kind of distaste for science. I mean, and this, by the way, is also true of his student Empson, who was a math major before he became an English major. Both of them take very seriously the notion that there can be a scientific basis for what one does in English or in literary studies. So another aspect of it for Richards is, because he takes science so seriously, is that he actually reverses the idea that we talked about last time in Sidney and Kant and Coleridge and Wilde and Wimsatt. He actually reverses the idea that it's art that's autonomous. If you look on page 766 in the left-hand column, you'll find him saying that science is autonomous. And what he means by that is that scientific facts can be described in statements without the need for any kind of psychological context or any dependency on the varieties of human need. It is autonomous in the sense that it is a pure, uncluttered, and uninfluenced declaration of fact or falsehood. Then he says, to declare science autonomous is very different from subordinating all our activities to it, and here's where poetry comes in. It is merely to assert that so far as any body of references is undistorted, it belongs to science. It is not in the least to assert that no references may be distorted if advantage can thereby be gained. And just as there are innumerable human activities which require undistorted references, scientific activities, if they are to be satisfied, so there are innumerable other human activities not less important which equally require distorted references or, more plainly, fictions. Here you see Richards's basic distinction between what he calls scientific statement and what he calls emotive statement. The distinction between that which is truly referential, that which is incontrovertibly verifiable or falsifiable on the one hand, and that which is emotive. Later on, Richards changes his vocabulary, and he no longer talks about scientific and emotive language. He talks instead, even more dangerously from the standpoint of anybody who likes poetry, he talks instead of statement, meaning science, and pseudo-statement, meaning poetry. I mean, you're really out on a limb if you're going to defend poetry, as Richards kept doing, as pseudo-statement. But of course, pseudo-statement is just another expression for what he calls here fiction. Now, why on earth, once we sort of settle into this vocabulary and once we get used to this clearly, unquestioningly scientific perspective, why on earth do you need pseudo-statement or fiction at all? We know very well, by the way, that there are scientists who simply cannot stand to read poetry because it's false. Right? You know, it's, I mean, it just as Richard says, you know, poetry, there's always something kind of archaic or atavistic about poetic thinking. It's not just that it's not trying to tell the truth, as Sidney said, nothing lieth because it never affirmeth. Not just that it's not trying to tell the truth, it is in fact, Richards goes so far as to say, following Plato, it is in fact lying. Poetry is constantly getting itself in trouble in all sorts of ways. And I mean, on page 768, for example, I know it's 768, although I can't find my reference in the lecture. See if I can find it in the book. It is evident, he says, at the top, sort of toward the top of the right-hand column, 768, it is evident that the bulk of poetry consists of statements which only the very foolish would think of attempting to verify. They are not the kinds of things which can be verified. Pack of lies. You know, I mean, and then we say, you know, it usually follows from this that somebody like this points out that whereas we all know that democratic society is the best society to live in, poetry prefers feudal society. It makes better poetry. And whereas we all know that the universe is of a certain kind, we can't even call it Copernican anymore, poetry has this odd preference for Ptolemaic astronomy. And you know, in other words, everything about poetry is atavistic. It's a throwback to some earlier way of thinking. There's some kind of latent primitivism in poetic thinking. And Richard seems cheerfully to embrace this idea. That's what he means by fiction or pseudo-statement. So why on earth do we want it? We want it, according to Richards, because it answers needs in our psychological makeup that science can't answer. In other words, we are, you know, a chaos of desires. Some of them involve the desire for truth, that is to say, for what we can learn from science. But a great many of our desires have nothing to do with any notion of truth, but rather are needs that require fanciful or imaginative fulfillment of other kinds. And the reason this fulfillment is important and can be valued is, according to Richards, that these needs, unless they are organized, harmonized, so that they work together in what he sometimes calls a synthesis, can actually tear us apart. Literature is what can reconcile conflicting or opposing needs. And Richards cares so much about this basic idea that in another text, not in the text you've just read, he says, shockingly, poetry is capable of saving us. In other words, poetry is capable of doing now what religion used to do. Poetry, and remember, this is a scientist, poetry is no more true than religion, but it can perform the function of religion and is therefore capable of saving us. And so, even despite the seeming derogation of the very thing that he purports to be celebrating in books like The Principles of Literary Criticism, Richards does hold out an extraordinarily important feeling for the mission of poetry, to harmonize conflicting needs. That's the role of poetry, and that's what it does simply by evoking our wishes, our desires, irrespective of truth, in their complicated, chaotic form and synthesizing them organically into something that amounts to psychological peace, something that leaves us. It's a little bit like Aristotle's idea of catharsis, which can be understood in a variety of ways, but Milton at the end of Samson Agonistes understands it in one way when he says, now we have, as a result of this tragedy, calm of mind, all passion spent. That could be the motto to Richards's work. The experience of art, the experience of poetry, the reconciliation of conflicting needs results in a kind of catharsis, calm of mind, all passion spent.